First, let us understand some of the terminology we use in this paper. Secondary cities in the Global South, SCGS. Global South is the developing world, whereas the Global North is the developed countries. By SCGS, what we mean are cities like Kantha in Vietnam or Colombo in Sri Lanka, Kendari in Indonesia, such cities. These cities are in the developing world and they are not yet mega cities and they are growing very fast. Because of that, infrastructure is often lagging behind the needs. We call this latter point adaptation deficits. Now, talking about adaptation, in the context of cities, we talk about two kinds of adaptation, type 1 and type 2. An example for type 1 adaptation is, let's say the city has many floods. So then you need to have flood barriers or some sort of flood management. If you have more water demand, you need to increase the capacity of the water supply. On the other hand, type 2 is anticipated needs like sea level rise, flooding will increase. So then you have to think about how to take care of that. That kind of anticipatory climate driven needs are called adaptation gaps. And we do type 2 actions to address adaptation gaps. In this paper, we try to make a simple point regarding adaptation in secondary cities in the global south. We argue that adaptation in SCGS is even more complicated than that in today's mature cities. SCGS need to reconcile both type 1 and type 2 adaptation needs and demands more inclusive and nuanced approach to adaptation. To understand that, let's look at this graph of city growth over time and the negative impact of that growth. Here we have the socially acceptable level of impact. Usually it is a sloping line because as cities grow, people become more and more demanding about the level of impact they can withstand. In the very early stages, in pristine stages, obviously towns had low level of negative impact. On the other hand, today's mature cities also have the status of relative stability and tolerable level of impacts. However, when you look at the history of these mature cities, you will see something remarkable. Almost all of these cities came through a stage of intolerable impact. If you look at the case of a mature city, regarding future, they have more or less two choices. Either they can do adaptation, largely of type 2 adaptation regarding climate change and maintain their level of low impact. Or they can do no adaptation and then of course the negative impacts will increase. The type 2 adaptation they have to do is almost exclusively driven by climate change because these cities are already stable, so their populations and other local parameters do not change so much. Now let's try to see SCGS in a similar graph. These cities are in a different position compared to mature cities on the graph. They are generally above socially acceptable level of impact and has complex adaptation outlook because they have to grapple with both adaptation deficits and adaptation gaps. Therefore, they need both type 1 and type 2 adaptation action. Doing nothing is not an option because both in the short term and long term, the impact will be unbearably high. Many of these cities have a tendency to focus on type 1 actions because of short term political and social pressure. But if they focus only on type 1 actions, while it might be satisfactory in the short term to somewhat reduce the impacts, in the long term, because of climate change and the very rapid local changes that is happening in these cities, it is going to be problematic. Now, if you do only type 2 adaptations, that might take care of the long term reasonably well. However, these cities have very significant adaptation deficits, which call for type 1 action. Doing only type 2 action will not take care of the adaptation needs in the short term. The only effective way to manage adaptation in SCGS we propose is to try to combine type 1 and type 2 adaptation actions. However, the cities find it really challenging to do both type 1 and type 2 actions. So there should be an innovative way to combine these two so that the burden of doing type 1 plus type 2 actions will be as less as possible. That topic we address in the part 2 of this paper.